2NURFM, a broadcast service of the University of Newcastle.
Every Tuesday we have a look at the world of politics with Professor Jim Jose. And Jim, we are really looking at the world today. We want to tackle the Middle East. How long have we got? Not enough time.
Definitely not, Mark. Good morning.
Look, so we were having a look at some of the current tensions with Iran and the US. So it's a bit of a flashpoint, but it seems to have backed off a bit. Where do we want to go?
Well, if we sort of take the flashpoint, the US has accused Iran of wanting to manufacture nuclear weapons, and they've got an issue around that. They've also got an issue around the bombings or the damage to a couple of tankers in the Persian Gulf, which they claim Iran is responsible for. One of them was a Japanese tanker, and the crew of the ship say, no, it wasn't a mine, as claimed by the US. They claim it was a flying object that hit the ship. What that means, I don't know. And the Japanese Prime Minister, who had visited Iran at about the time that one of the explosions happened, also reaffirmed their friendship, Japan's friendship with Iran. So the tensions between Japan and Iran were non-existent. They had good relations. The issue, as we saw happen over the past week, when President Trump threatened to launch a strike against Iran and then changed his mind and ordered the strike off, allegedly because there was a prediction of about 150 US casualties in the process. In addition, the US Vice President, Mike Pompeo, made the claim that the US is only responding to what he claims is 40 years of Iranian aggression against the US. Now, I think that comment, Mark, basically is indicative of the way in which the US manoeuvres its particular geopolitical position and positions itself as the innocent party. But we have to go back. Basically, Pompeo's claim is just arrant nonsense. But the whole thing about the US and Iran at present also shows that President Trump's behaviour is not so unusual in terms of presidential comments around Iranian leadership, etc. So if we take this back a little bit, Iran was basically a British colony at one stage before a colony in the sense that the British had some degree of control and authority over it, and Iran was sort of created, as it were, from what used to be Persia. By the end of the Second World War, the British treated Iran as its protectorate. The US had designs on it as well. There was an oil company called Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, which was largely a British company, but in order to have the rights to work there, they created a joint company. Interestingly enough, that went on subsequently to become BP, British Petroleum. But in the post-war era, Iran was still a protectorate. And in 1953, in the 1950s, 1951, Mr. Mossadegh became the Iranian Prime Minister, and Iran had its sort of first democratic series of elections and some degree of success. But the one thing that Mossadegh did was nationalise the oil company in order to assert control over it. That sparked a response from both the US and Britain, and then there was a coup, which it's well documented that the US and Britain made sure that the Prime Minister was overthrown and the Shah of Iran, who became the Shah of Iran, Pahlavi, was reinstated and his family put back on the throne. And they then had Iran as a sort of favourable ally in the Middle East. Unfortunately for the Iranian people, the Shah ruled with a very, very strong authoritarian style, and their secret police, the Shavak, were dreaded as they were basically used to keep the dissidents in the population in line. Eventually, this led to what inevitably happens after decades of repression. It bubbles over, and then there was another coup or revolution, I guess you'd say, in which the Shah of Iran was overthrown and the Ayatollah Khomeini was put in place. He then became the demon in the Middle East, so much so that the US encouraged Saddam Hussein, when he was head of Iraq to invade Iran, and then there was a war between Iraq and Iran, which was a proxy war basically for the US. At the same time, some of the Iranian students in 1979 invaded the US embassy and held some US embassy officials hostage for well over a year, 440 days I think it was. And that was, quite an affront to the US and quite a terrible experience for the people concerned. However, the US treated that as, typical Iranian hostilities and painted the Iranian government in a very bad way. So as a result of that and the Iraq-Iranian war, the US government was funding some very nasty people to destabilise Iran. So the Iranian situation has always been tense since 1979. Unfortunately, during this time as well in the 80s, a US battleship in the Persian Gulf accidentally shot down an Iranian airliner, killing 262 civilians, for which the US never apologised, as far as I'm aware. Vice President George Bush, the father, said that he would never apologise no matter what the facts were. Ronald Reagan called it a barbaric slaughter in the sky perpetrated by Iranians, which is really hard to reconcile with the fact that they managed to convince a US battleship to shoot down their own plane, their own commercial airliner. The comments by those particular presidents, President Carter, who was the human rights president, for example, regarded the Shah of Iran as a model of government. So when President Trump comes out and makes his comments and they seem a little outlandish, he's not necessarily being out of step with how past presidents, Mark.
It's kind of like we've read this book before.
Yes. So what's going on at the moment, and in particular there's a sort of rewriting of history so that we see Iran as the demon, and the context in which this takes place over most of the 20th century, in which Iran has been, shall we say, the puppet of the Western powers, is forgotten. That's not factored in. And if Iran responds to assert its sovereignty or its rightful independence, it's seen as doing the wrong thing. Whereas the US, in its manipulation of this and the particular stories it's telling, saying that the explosions on these on these oil tankers have been caused by Iran. They are behind it all, and this is justification for us to intervene. That's a movie we've seen, time and time again. And in this particular case, it's particularly worrying because with the Middle East at a flashpoint in various parts, another war for the US military action in Iran is just going to exacerbate the already tense relationships with other parts of the Middle East.
You would also think that if that happens, that would not be that wouldn't go down well at home. You would think, you would hope. Well, because again, there's been so much of it over the last couple of decades. Would there not be almost battle fatigue?
There is some of that, but it's curious how the US population can be brought into, let's say, a compliant position and accepting the president's pronouncements that the problem is Iran, the problem is not how we behave as a nation, the problem is how they behave, and if they don't do the right thing, i.e. what is in our interest, then we have the right to pressure them. At the moment, what we're seeing is a form of bullying behaviour at the international level where a far, far stronger power, both militarily and economically, is asserting itself and asserting the right to ensure that Iran, a smaller, less economically powerful nation, is brought into line. And of course, where Iran is situated, partly because of its oil, but also its proximity to Russia, means that the US are really concerned and they really want to make sure that Iran lines up with it rather than goes too independent. So there's a bit at stake for the US, but certainly I think to take a sort of more interpretive position on this, Mark, the way they're going about it appears to sort of be counterproductive.
All right. Well, it was on, then it was off again, which hopefully the off again stays. We'll watch it, I'm sure, with great interest. The Middle East, it's a whole different game, Jim.
Well, we hope that President Trump has now had his little outburst and he's moved on to focus on other things and allowing the Iranian situation to calm down. But we need to be a bit cautious.
Yeah, has got some stuff at home happening at the moment as well. Thank you, our Professor of Politics, Jim Jones.
My pleasure, Mark.
We'll talk to you next Tuesday right here at 2NURFM 103.7.